And I'm Dr. Eric Montgomery. I'm a cultural anthropologist, originally from Flint, Michigan, and did my PhD at Wayne State University. I'm now in the Peace and Conflict Studies Department, where I teach African conflicts, also graduate peace and security studies, also classes in medicine and global equity. In the past, I was in the Irvin D. Reed Honors College for 8 years as a senior lecturer, teaching in political science and also anthropology. And I've been ongoing at the College for Creative Studies, teaching graduate classes and also anthropology, various anthropology classes at Wayne State and in the Detroit area. The vision and mission for Culture Realm really came together sort of organically. Both Graham and David were with my colleague, Dr. Vanier, at Grand Valley State, and Nishant was mine, and I believe Christian student as well, at Wayne State University. And we started talking a lot about visual anthropology and critical theory and modern theory, and with the advent of globalization and the change with social media, we wanted to do something that can invoke justice and democracy in the world. And our mission and vision at Culture Realm is to do just that, to allow for a full democratization of content for folks from all around the world to map their own life stories, their own narratives, their own cultures, so that we can share with one another and get to understand one another and hopefully move toward dispute resolution and more sustained positive peace in the future. So we're a team of guys trying something out. This is our first podcast, and we're going to sort of offer a template that we're going to offer other folks. Hopefully this will be the first of many more podcasts to come. But just to give you a picture, all four of us are sitting here on a snowy February day in Hamtramck in 2016, and sort of set the context. So David.
All right. So Eric, you mentioned a little bit about your research in the past, but can you tell us more about your time in Togo and the Ewe people?
Sure.
Talk about maybe Judy and how you know her.
Sure.
How all that came about. A little bit maybe about the language and culture of Ewe folks and whatever else.
Well, they say in Ewe, especially in voodoo circles, that you don't choose the spirit of the God chooses you. The God chooses you. And I think that's sort of exactly what happened with my own life story. You referenced Judy Rosenthal, who's a professor emeritus from University of Michigan, now living in California. I went with her and her husband at the time, a Togolese Ewe gentleman named Silvio Tete. Wasn't a doctor, but Silvio Tete, professor as well, when I was 19 years old. As a kid growing up in the Flint area, it's sort of a weird thing when you live in this liminal between and betwixt sort of world. And growing up in the 80s and 90s, and with deindustrialization and the lack of jobs, it was a really trying time. And in the area where I live, there's a lot of, the white folks and black folks are very different. Not so much within the city limits of Flint, but definitely on the outskirts of the area. So I always had a sort of addiction, I'm not afraid to say that, to black culture in general. And I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I was reading things like James Baldwin, and just really addicted to African American, the civil rights movement, and later on the Black Power movement. So when I went as a 19-year-old kid to Africa, I was excited because this was the route, right? A leaf doesn't tell a root what to do. We went to Africa. And after seeing my first instance of spirit possession, there's two things you see when you see somebody go into trance, I think. Number one is non-African people, I think we get a little bit afraid, but also jealous. To see somebody move like that, to feel that syncopated, beautiful rhythm, and to feel the spirit go into and to witness all that, it invokes fear, but also a little bit of jealousy. I think this is the archetype of racist minds. The second thing it does is it leaves you awe-inspiring. And not to the point where your fear almost translates into something where, wow, that's one of the most amazing, phantasmagoric things I've ever witnessed. What's going on here? And you start to realize that science has sort of killed much of the world. Sometimes for a good thing. I believe in science myself in a big way. But to see a religion live like that, the way voodoo was in Africa, was something that changed me forever. So much so that I ended up dedicating my life to it, going to grad school, and the last 20 years of my life I've done research there. So that's a little bit about how I came to voodoo and how I came to anthropology while I was at the University of Michigan, Flint, and with a little bit of my own life story.
Mind if I ask a follow-up question to that? You sort of used your experience in Flint as a bridge to how you became interested in Africa in general. What was it like? You were first interested in African American culture, and then you went to the heart of Africa. Like, what? Can you show us what the connection was like?
Yeah, it was incredible for me, especially to be going with a group from Flint that was mostly African Americans. You had one of two things to not stereotype the result. You had those who, we actually had a gentleman who went with us on that trip who was walking in Ghana, and a lady was in trance and started screaming, and she ended up thinking he was from there, and he ended up tracing his lineage and moved back there. This was a light-skinned brother from the north side. And then you had some other students who were freaked out by the size of the insects, and there was almost this disconnect where, wow, I may be African American, but I'm not this, where you almost buy into your own stereotype. Because a lot of folks, not just black folks, but working class folks all around the world, they don't really get outside of their own bubble. But it validated every fiber of my emotion and heart, which told me there's something very special about not just black culture, but black spirituality in general. And we can cut it up into voodoo and Christianity and Islam and all these labels, but really throughout all that runs this real black spirituality that supersedes everything. It's a very different experience going to an African American church, for example, than going to a Catholic church or a Northern evangelical church. It's very different going to a Southern evangelical white church compared to a Southern evangelical Baptist black church, for example. But what rides through all of that is this deep spirituality, this veil between this world and the other world that is very thin. With African spirituality, and it's deep. You know, people look at it as an oral culture, and they think, you know, and I was really into hip hop and things like that when I was a kid too. You know, thinking about it, and my heroes were people like Angela Davis. I really, you know, and as I've gotten older, I'm still equally as quote unquote revolutionary. I've toned it down a little bit, but black spirituality and black nationalism, whether it's in Africa or America, is going against really white supremacy. And as somebody who is not somebody of color, I see that, and I think it's not enough to just sit there with what Donald Trump's going on or with Africa to buy into these stereotypes and, oh, this is voodoo dancing around a fire, and this is pins and needles, and this is going to curse people, and these African Americans, you know, a lot of Africans will say it, they have it so much better in America than they do here. What are they crying about? Sometimes Africans will say that, and African Americans will, look at Africa as if it's this tribal place. But in the end, there's this huge spectrum of black culture that is very inclusive. It's very receptive. It's also very comprehensive.
Well, why do you think that you were personally attracted to that, both as a kid in Flint and when you actually went to, it was Togo, right?
I think, you know what it was, is growing up in the Flint area, I went to a place to school called Lapeer that was a pretty, I guess if Flint was Africa, Lapeer would have been the deep white Mississippi South or something, right? And most of the folks of color, and there was quite a few Latinos and a lot more African Americans in that area where I went to school now. That's who I hung out with. That's who I rolled with. So I got called things like wigger and stereotyped, and although my oppression would never meet that of a person of color, I really related to it with very deep empathy, and I knew what it was like to be casted out for being different or trying to be, something that you weren't, or however people sort of framed it. And the other big thing is hip hop. Growing up as a kid from the age of 12 through the age of 16 or 17, that Public Enemy was my Bible. KRS-One was my preacher and my deacon. Yeah. And you say, well, what the hell does that have to do with voodoo in Africa? At the time, I didn't know, right. But now I realize everything. It's all one big, embedded, connected matrix of black spirituality and black culture that is something I wish I could be a part of. And the best way for me to be a part of it and understand it has been through anthropology and by living with folks and trying to understand it. And although I will never be African or African American, I would like to think that a part of my personhood and identity and who I am is at least pierced with an element and a nod toward that. And that's sort of how I've dedicated my life and where I want to go with it. There's so much to learn and so much to know. And we've done so many horrible things in this country to black folks that I feel like it's my duty to combat that with intelligence and with knowledge and with sustained, ongoing projects that help make people who are oppressed make their lives a little better, whether it be in Flint or Detroit or in West Africa.
So you were, when you first got there, you were 19, you were going to the same village.
The same village. Since then, I'm now 40 years old. I don't know, for 21 years, I think about 7 or 8 trips to West Africa now, total of about probably almost 2 years of my life. The longest I was there was for 8 months during my dissertation research at one time in 2003 and 2004. But I was there in 1996, 2001, 2003, 2004, 2008, 2011, and I think 2013. And yeah, the village, the same people I saw going to, when I went there, the group left after 3 weeks. We went to Ghana, Togo, and Benin, and we checked out all the slave castles and, did all sorts of really wonderful things. Visited indigenous farms, and we went to a voodoo ceremony at the village that I'll call here Baydala in Togo in 1996. And I changed my flight. My mom she wanted me to come home. And upon the recommendation of anthropologist Judy Rosenthal, she said, why don't you spend a couple weeks in the village if you really like this? So I did. I spent a few weeks in the village, extended my trip. And the same people who are my age then, I've literally grown up with. Sometimes via Western Union, sometimes via the cell phone. And other times when I go there. But yeah, my friends and the priest there is like a father to me, the main priest in the village, the main family connected to him, and the fishermen and his sons and children are like brothers to me. And they've even named kids after me in the village, even though they're not biologically mine, as a nod of respect to me and also a way to ensure that I will help to take care of those kids. So there's a few kids named Eric Evie in the village, and Evie in Ewe means little or child of Eric, even though it's not mine biologically. I promise you, my wife would not be happy.
So you got tight with these people and you grew up with them, kind of in a way, like
Sure.
So can you tell me more about like a day in the life of when you're doing ethnography?
Sure.
At this point, you're going there and you're doing ethnography, right?
Yeah.
And you got a book coming out.
Sure.
And you got a film coming out.
Sure.
You've already put out a couple films, Chasing the Spirit and what's the other?
African Erdman.
African Erdman. So what is for our people who want to travel? Not just anthropology students, but people who want to travel somewhere that's not Spain, France, London, Germany kind of deal. Tell us about like a day in the life. What's it like doing research in a place like Togo, which we have no idea what it's like?
Sure. Well, Ghana, Togo, the Ewe people are actually stretched across 3 colonies because of the partitioning. Togo at one time was actually German up until 1917. It was actually the first fall in World War I. Ghana was colonized historically by England, and then Benin, which was Dahomey nearby, also by France. So you have at least 3 colonial powers overlapping. And in the south of Ghana, Togo, and Benin are the Ewe people. And there's different Ewe people are related to Aja people, and there's Adangbe people who are closely related peoples, and Mina peoples who speak linguistically a similar language. But as a whole, you got a few million people there in Ghana, Togo, and Benin, and a typical day there is very different because you've had the same political power and party in power in Togo since independence, since an overthrow, I believe in 1963. So from 1967 up until a couple years ago, one dictator, the longest serving dictator, I believe in African history, Gnassingbé Eyadema, was the president. And now his son, Faure, who's been much more inclusive and much better compared to his father, has taken over, but he's changed the constitution, and this president for life problem continues to persist. So what I'm getting at there in a typical day is it's very different in Ghana, in Togo, and Benin. You'll get shook down by the military. You'll see this in Ghana, Togo, and Benin, but you're probably safer, at least dealing with the military, without a doubt, in Ghana than you are in Togo. Although the Togolese military will oppress and hurt their own citizens much more than they will the quote-unquote white anthropologist or American. In Benin, you have an interesting history as well because they were communist going from the 70s up until 89, I believe, with Karakou, and now they've opened up and expanded and sort of gone a lot more. They've adhered a lot more to global capitalistic principles and quote-unquote Western democracy as a whole. So it's different in all 3 of those places. But in Africa, things move fast. Life along the south is very different than life in the north. Life in the north is much quieter. It's much more quote-unquote real Africa. But in the south, you have this mix of colonial history, and you have a melange of ethnic groups from throughout West Africa and beyond. And a daily life for me, at least in the village, is to get up, go to the shrine, normally with a bottle of gin in hand and some kola nuts to break bread with the gods, and moving from Koundé all the way through Nana Wango. I make prayers. I pray for my own family. I make offerings throughout the day. And then normally I have predetermined set up some video shoots of different things I want to shoot. Maybe sometimes it's rituals, or sometimes it's a day at the market, at the fish market. But what I've really tried to do recently is try to equip them with cameras and do this participatory ethnography where the people in the village, whether it be a fisherman or a voodoo drummer or a priest assistant or a spirit host or a spirit wife in trance, to have them sort of have their own camera, their own notebooks, and write down their own ideas, record things. And then we have these feedback screenings on a bi-weekly basis where they come in and sort of share with me what they want to talk about and what they think is important, and then we code. But most days from the shrine, after we do that, I'll go visit other folks. I'll do interviews. Sometimes I'll hold focus groups. Sometimes they're semi-structured interviews. A lot of times we spend time in the taxi going to visit other people, mostly asking questions around political economy, ritual and religion, and then identity-based things and things about people's lives. And I try to tie in all these separate realms of anthropology, applied anthropology, cultural anthropology, medical anthropology, and really sort of take this big cosmic approach that everything in voodoo is embedded. And, everything from the music down to the plants that go into the actual fetishes So the science and the music itself is connected to identity. It's a very deep way of looking at things. In fact, I think Joseph Campbell once said, when asked about where in the world is religion actually lived and participated instead of just talked about, and he said Equatorial Africa, and he referred specifically to voodoo and Orisha, because the spirits are really there, kind of like angels in the Christian realm. They're there and they're hovering above in a very near vicinity, in a very near area. Imagine a world like that, where you actually believe that your ancestors are there, present, where the dead can take over the body of the living. And so the dead creates the living and the living creates the dead, and there's this thick dialectic and this nuance between this world and the other world. What is supernatural? Super means beyond nature. What is beyond is embedded in a way that is deep, and that goes down to the music, to this plant medicine, to the rituals, to right down to where you get your money and what your daily activities are. So I try to be a participant observer, an ethnographer. I try to merge in. I've picked up some of the language. I've learned how to speak fluent French, and I try to do things as the Africans do. When they eat, I try to eat with them. I've learned how to prepare food. I've done work in the garden. I've gone out on fishing charters. But mostly I'm poking around, just being the anthropologist. I used to walk around with my camera all the time and my notebook, and now I just bring a small notebook, and I only bring my camera when it's predetermined because you really miss out on things. And I bring just a small notebook that I keep in my pocket, and I take a few notes, and at the end of each evening I take that notebook and I turn it into about an hour of note-taking and code everything throughout the day. And then I take pictures that I take from my video and still shots, and I'll actually print them up in the field, and I'll create my own scenes and my own murals to sort of visualize where I want to go with the next film. In the next film, we want to sort of follow Kofi, my friend I've known since I'm 19, but tell the story of voodoo and tell the story of Togolese resistance. And through his life and through his story, what it's like being a drummer, what it's like being the head voodoo priest in all of Togo's son, what it's like being an alcoholic, what it's like not having steady employment when you have 5 or 6 kids, through Kofa, whether we call it Finding Kofa or Following Kofa, and I know you guys are all going to help me out on the film, we'll determine that, but I really want to personalize it. The first 2 films were more an overview of what Chasing the Spirit was, more an overview what is spirit possession, what is divination, and then African Herb Band was tying the plant medicine and the healing episodes and spirit possession together in the greater complex that is indigenous or traditional medicine. The next film I want to tell the story of voodoo, the big picture again, and its ties to political economy and its embeddedness and this notion that the other world and this world is embedded, but I want to tell it through Kofa in a real personal narrative way. And ideally I would like to use Culture Realm where people in the village are actually equipped with cameras and they're uploading their own content about their own lives so that this guy from above, this anthropologist, American guy, isn't telling their story.
Right. That's I like the video voice that you do with people, and not just doing video voice, but walking around with them and not filming, but just talking. Yeah. How do you think that your presence and just the fact that you're asking about political economy and their cultural heritage and their lived experience every day, how does that affect, you think, the folks you know in the village compared to a neighboring village who are not really getting the same contact with you? Do you think they're more aware of their situation within the slave coast or Africa in general or the rest of the world?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Well, in Togo, people don't talk about the military, and even me talking about it, I don't want to endanger anyone because people have been so oppressed and subjugated. They just don't talk about it, period. There's people who get, there's a long history of even the Occupy and Let's Save Lome, the Occupy Lome Togo movement and the Let's Save Togo movement. A lot of voodoo priests and people have been at the head of this, but they've also made their way and been hired by the government and have positions of power and stuff like that. So the consciousness of the village compared to the external areas, the hegemony is so deep and so pervasive that no one talks about politics at all. People in Ghana are very outspoken. People in Nigeria are very outspoken. In Benin, even a little bit more so than they are in Togo, because you've had the same party and the same family in power for almost 50 years now. So people are conscious of that. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to incriminate themselves, but they will talk to you about voodoo and they will talk about religion in a very big way. But most people in the world, what they want to talk about is how to feed their families and how to get jobs. And the average annual income in my village is somewhere between $2 and $4, depending on how you ask. The unemployment rate among men is higher than 50%. The alcoholism rate among men is higher than 50%. No one, to my knowledge, in all my years of going there, has ever attended a university. And about half of the girls are just now, still in 2016, don't even go to secondary school. A lot of the fees are paid by me and by local people, including a local Spanish hotelier and people to pay for it. So people are worried about eating. It is a fishing village, and what's happened within the last 10 years, you get a few years where things are better, during the rainy season and during the fishing season, where they get some boom crops. But as a whole, fishing has been absolutely decimated. And it's been decimated for several reasons. Number one, unlicensed trawlers pay fees to people, like to the government and stuff like that to fish. They use long lines that are illegal, some of them stretching for several dozen miles. And in the morning they come and they drop off the junk fish that they don't want to the West Africans themselves, and the other ones go on to Asia and to markets in Europe, and even the United States. So this underdevelopment through fishing is affecting the daily lives of people. Now, folks, when I first went there in the 1990s, 80 to 90% of the village would have been tied to the fishing industry in some way. Either on the fish, either boat captains, either women smoking fish, or women getting fish for barter and for trade and going into cities. The farther north it goes, after you smoke it, the more fish is worth, and things like that. So nowadays you have some people employed in the service industry. You have some people who work the gravel industry nearby as a whole. But to specifically answer your question, people are worried about eating, and it's a very different game in Ghana, Togo, and Benin. Even though you might have brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles, that are your close related kin, you could be literally in 3 different countries, especially the Ghana-Togo border. That's a big deal. So people don't talk too much about politics, and I don't ask too much. It's unethical. When I do my IRB and my HIC approval to get approval to do research, at least when I'm at Wayne State, I have to not incriminate anything or engage in risky behavior. So not only do I have to use pseudonyms, but what I get about politics, I don't get from the people. They don't tell me about that. It's stuff that I know that's more nuanced. And the same would be true for other villages in the area. However, I will say that voodoo villages as a whole are among some of the poorest villages in all of Africa and in the South. Really poor.
Thank you.
Yeah, long answer.
No, if you can imagine, I just got pointed at by the professor, by Dr. Eric Montgomery. So I'm glad that I get a chance to ask a question here. I was wondering, for a lot of listeners, they might sit here like voodoo and spirit possession and stuff like that. You sort of, since you're so used to it, and since that's your field of study. It doesn't seem out of the ordinary to you. It just sort of something you can imagine casually. But other people listening might be like, whoa, like this guy's getting involved in voodoo and stuff. He's not just studying it. He's actually participating in the religious rituals and whatnot. Can you sort of dispel some stereotypes people might have about voodoo?
Sure.
And talk about what your experience.
Well, first of all, let me say that no matter where you go in the world, black folks are the most oppressed people in the world, and that's been the case for the history of the world for the last 400 years. In Brazil, where you have candomblé and these African religions say, oh, in the north, in Bahia, we don't have these racist problems like you. Well, when I went to Brazil, it was dark black folks carrying my bags. But not only are black people more oppressed anywhere you go, but voodoo is probably the most oppressed religion in the history of the world. And that comes out of American media, really going back to the 1920s. Really, more importantly, it comes out of the fact that it was a voodoo ceremony which invoked and ignited the revolution in Haiti in Saint-Domingue in 1791. And that's the first black republic. And if we don't think color and race is a part of that, that's another reason. But yeah, there's never been a religion or a folks than black voodoo people more discriminated against, more disenfranchised, more mislabeled, more misunderstood, at least in my knowledge, anywhere in the world. And voodoo is the root. It pre-exists. It's at least 10,000, some would say 15,000 years old, voodoo or greater voodoo. Now, when I refer to voodoo, I'm talking about Orisha. I'm also talking about traditional African religion in general, and that veil between this world and the other world being very thin. But voodoo really means, vo and voodoo, do means to eat something or take something. It means to, depending on who you ask, but it means to fetch water. It means canopy over heaven. It means spirit. It means breath. Because to breathe, and you have a big shadow and a little shadow. But voodoo is a way of life. It is lived, like I alluded to earlier, like no other religion that I know on earth. Even being married to a Hindu and my wife, it was a very lived religion. And seeing even Sufi mystics and Sufi Islam, compared to looking at Sunni and Shia, it's more lived experience. But even looking at Native American, think about it. They create their own gods with their own hands. The fetishes and the amount of things that go into these fetishes is absolutely astounding. Literally, sometimes hundreds of plants, knives, mercury, marijuana, bullets, gunpowder, this animal blood, that animal blood, ground up lion's claws, raven's teeth, right? Literally, these go in. So imagine a world where you A, construct your own gods, and then B, they take over your body to the point where you're just a horse. That's, Zora Neale Hurston and all this divine horseman. You're just a horse. You're just a vessel. It's not you anymore. And when you go into trance, and it's normally women who go into trance because of men, and there's a lot of theories about that coming from I.M. Lewis and forward. you actually have more power than sometimes the priest or the local big man or the local mama Benz or rich person when you're in trance, because it's not you anymore, it's the God. And when the God takes over your body, the gods are very moralistic. Now, these gods I look at in Goro Voodoo are northern medicine gods that come out of resistance. They actually come at the turn of the century at a time of exploding cocoa plantations and exploding wealth. And that wealth, that haves and have-nots, created a lot of social chaos. So in order to deal with that chaos, they invoke these different medicine gods. So these Goro Voodoos, Goro meaning kola nut and Hausa, Voodoo meaning spirit, the spirit of the kola nut, is actually an appropriation of northern gods that were at one time separate that have been assembled into a southern voodoo pantheon. That goes alongside the Yeve voodoo, the more big macro voodoos that we know about, like Hevieso, Shango, or Legba, or Oshun, or Mamiwata, the different names. So literally you have Goro voodoo gods next to Yeve voodoo gods, next to Chamba voodoo gods, because they enslaved a lot of people from the north. So these slaves come back and re-inhabit the bodies of these southern bodies, these southern Ewe bodies. And then you also have Sofobisi, the main priest, he was raised Catholic, and he knows the Bible very well. He talks from Revelations. And then on top of that, you have these Salah, these prayer Muslim elements, because Goro comes from the north and Kola Nut comes from the north, and it's tied and romanticized to Islam. You have these Islamic elements, like the prostration of the faith, and even the Shahada, and these different elements that are interwoven. So it's this big, inclusive, complex thing that anthropologists and religious scholars also often call syncretism, as if they're mixed up or confused. It's not syncretism at all. It's appropriation and it's inclusivity at work at the same time. Really, Muslims, Christians, all of us can learn from voodoo. They're not knocking on our doors saying, hey, you need to accept Muhammad as your prophet. There is no prophet but Muhammad, or if you don't worship Jesus, you're going to go to hell. On the contrary. But there's still these elements, these bigger elements of Christianity, old Judaism, Islam, and all these different traditional African elements, including several voodoos, that all come together to make up the cosmology and the religious life of voodoo adherents among the Ewe.
Very interesting. And I think maybe for people who don't think about West African religions very often, they might think, oh, this sounds so out of left field, it sounds so crazy. But then, you've talked about before how much, the different faiths have influenced each other and the different faiths have mixed, and how really, hasn't there been some influence from these kind of ideas on Western religions?
Absolutely. And that's one of the least talked about things. And I think here from 2016 forward, by 2050, not only where we're going with genetics, which is exciting, but the history in the roots of religion in Africa is going to, we know we all come out of Africa. That's pretty much proven and accepted amongst anthropologists across the board. But the influence of traditional African religion in the Middle East and in North Africa is going to really move minds. And it looks like the Ewe have history that they come out of Palestine, interestingly. Not all of them adhere to this and believe this, but they believe that they were in Egypt. Many voodoo priests in Orisha, what they call Babalaos in Orisha, or what they call Bokono Sophos in voodoo, these Sophos, these priests, they believe that they were in Black Egypt, in a very Black Egypt place. And, of course, Egypt precedes Greece and Rome and all that. And I don't want to get into this Afrocentrist argument of what's superior and all that. But the fact that voodoo is looked at as primitive and savage when it is probably the root of all of our major faiths, even the Abrahamic religions, is really a sad thing. And I think that's a big part that contributes to the way in which voodoo is desecrated and mystified. Mystification becomes the process of explaining away what might otherwise be evident. And until you're on the ground and you feel and you look at this stuff and you go through initiations and you see it, you don't realize A, how inclusive it is, and B, how historic it is. They always tell me a leaf cannot tell a root what to do. Voodoo is a root. Christianity and Judaism being before them, in Islam, and not to be disrespectful, but in a chronological way, they're leaves, and a leaf doesn't tell a root what to do. In other words, and there's another Ewe quote that the beard doesn't tell stories to the eyebrow, right? The beard comes after you go through puberty maybe or whatever, but you're born with these eyebrows. These eyebrows have been there. And I kind of look at voodoo as that, not to get into the superior thing, but not only is it not the conflated, ridiculous, diabolical bloodlust crap that we see all the time, but it's actually probably a base and foundation for many of the faiths throughout the world. And there's also new research that the sacred feminine in Africa, new research, and if you go to mamiwata.com and look it up, there's some good theories going on. A lot of this stuff isn't happening with scholars, it's happening on the ground with priests and other peoples. There's some new research that maybe as Christianity and Judaism and later on Islam are so afraid of the black spirit possession in the black body, especially the female power, that we had to construct these patriarchal religions in order to control. And I don't want to get too political with that and go there. I don't sound like an academic when I say that, but I do think there's something to that. And I think we're going to find out more about that in the near future.
So if we could get, to come back to kind of like current day.
Yes.
So you're talking about how voodoo is really like still very much alive and well in America, even just in like, black culture
Sure.
and music.
Sometimes unconscious, yes.
And over the years in Africa, voodoo has not only survived but it's thrived despite all the colonialism. So it's like would you say it's like a survivor religion?
Well, yes.
Or a battles colonialism?
In some ways, this is a good question, because not only we can argue that Goro Voodoo as a cult is definitely growing. We can argue that the Orisha that we see in Brazil and places is growing, but the thing that gets missing that is Christianity and Islam are growing even more. So even where voodoo is growing, it's not growing at the pace of Christianity and Islam. At its roots, where there's the only national holiday for voodoo or for really traditional African religion that I know about in all of Africa is in Benin. They have a national holiday. Benin has the highest percentage and rate of Catholics in the world right now. So the evangelicals on one hand and the Catholic Church are doing some good things, but also some bad things to get rid of voodoo. However, the political situation in Togo has sort of worked as a conservatory of sense, a repository of sense. And for some reason, the voodoo, the Goro Voodoo and the voodoo that we know in Togo is growing, as is the Goro Voodoo in the Volta region of Ghana, probably because it heals, because of the medicine. They can do more for sickle cell anemia. They can do more for drug addiction. They can do things for breaks and fractures. They can do things for waterborne illnesses and malaria. They can bring up T-cell counts. They can do a lot of amazing things with these plants. Of course, people still die from diarrhea. I'm not trying to say it's superior, but that's one reason the voodoo has grown in Goro Voodoo, because of its efficacy and it's tied to medicine. The reason in which it's grown, remember, in America, they took away drums. Folks weren't allowed to drum here at all. In Dominican Republic and in Cuba and, of course, on Black Haiti Island, it was allowed to boom because they overthrew white folks. The only place that people were allowed to drum here in the United States was a place called Congo Square in New Orleans, which today is Louis Armstrong Park. And if you went there on the Sunday in the early 1920s, you would have seen spirit possession. You could look at Mary Laveau and the Great Snake Goddess and look at all the history and the nostalgia. But out of that little kernel of Haitian immigrants being so bad in Haiti that they come to New Orleans to work, out of those Haitian immigrants being in New Orleans, voodoo and hoodoo is very different than voodoo anyways. But still, you get these Haitian folks living in New Orleans at Congo Square, going into trance, playing the drum. And who's Mary Laveau related to? Eula Echo, right? Jelly Roll Morton. Later on, Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil so that he can play the blues, the Crossroads, all these references that are implicit. Later on, Miles Davis, when he rewrites jazz and it goes kind of blue, going kind of cool. These are West African elements. Not only are they West African elements, they're voodoo elements. So I'm saying here that we have no Elvis Presley, we have no rock and roll, we have no jazz, we have none of this stuff. Not just without Africans and without bringing them here. They didn't come here, they were brought here via slavery, but without voodoo and Orisha specifically. The numbers are around 60 million around the world, depending on who you ask, with a huge number of Orisha people still being in Nigeria and then in Brazil. I would say probably 2 million people. Out of the 6 million people in Togo, I would say probably about 500,000 of them are voodoo worshippers. So depending on how you categorize it, the numbers are somewhere between 12 and 50 million worldwide.
So it's been able to survive colonialism and oppression in a big way, right?
Yes.
And so now, fast forward to now, Kendrick Lamar drops To Pimp a Butterfly,
Absolutely.
and it's a huge album. I mean, it's making shockwaves culturally,
right.
artistically, across academics, across
right.
the U.S.
And
right.
he basically makes the connection that you made between like Flint and the motherland or whatever. You know, he in his latest Oscars performance, at the end of his song, at the end of his performance, there was projected on the screen was the map of Africa with like as if it was a capital or as if it was a city, the word Compton.
Which, by the way, is right by where Togo is.
Yes.
On the map.
Ironically,
You know?
yeah. Now, I will say this about Kendrick Lamar and about Beyonce at the Super Bowl, and this Black Lives Matters is the best thing that's happened for folks of color, in my opinion. This is not born in the 1960s. The 1960s were seminal to civil rights. What people are missing out is it's that same 80s you were asking me about earlier, Graham. People who grew up with this hip-hop and this consciousness and this anger, especially in deindustrialized, segregated, racially segregated areas like Flint or Saginaw, Michigan, or Detroit, or Gary, Indiana, or Buffalo, New York, or Cleveland, Ohio, or what have you. There is this consciousness, and what you're seeing is this forward escape into the past. Even Christian black folks, even quote-unquote commercial folks, are starting to recognize the importance of Africa and recognizing that a part of their identity and who they are overlaps with this history and with this music. And you see a blow up with Fela Kuti. You know, you think about even Bob Marley. You know, Bob Marley doesn't get tied or talked about voodoo or things things like this, but this is a Pan-Africanist. This is an Afrocentrist. He, by the way, is literally God in Africa. They celebrate his birthday and close down bars throughout all of Africa. But imagine that. Think of one other third world rock star that can even touch Bob Marley. This little island of Jamaica. And that resistance that is in reggae, that is in roots and things like that, was in these social movements of voodoo and Orisha movements. And these movements in voodoo and Orisha were more than anti-colonial. They were about empowering people. If you were a bad priest and you didn't heal somebody, or you concocted witchcraft and you brought what the Ave call maso, you brought conflict and chaos into the life, you wouldn't be a leader anymore. It's that simple. Here we have Donald Trump, he who wins with the most wins. I'm a billionaire. I know how to do this. Look at this. In Africa, he would be nothing, because it isn't how much you have, it's how much you reciprocate and how much you give away. And these are not voodoo ethics. These are African ethics that also run parallel and paradigmatically to voodoo and Orisha and indigenous religion as a whole. But it's always been about resistance, folks. No one wants to see voodoo thrive and do well. No one wants to see it. So it's had to go underground and do things like create jazz and blues, and then no one make that connection. Yeah. By the way, that should be in every American history book. We're in Black History Month, the last day of Black History Month coming up. Every American history book in the country should learn about the ties to voodoo in American music, and especially learn about the history of New Orleans in tandem with the history of slavery. It's one of the most important, because this isn't just Black history. This is American history.
Well, like in Kendrick Lamar's performance, he first walks out in I guess in chains. Chains with a bunch of gang. He's dancing behind him. Yeah, he's in a chain gang. His band is in the jail, and then eventually he breaks out of that scene, and he walks to the next stage setup. But he's led by a drummer drumming voodoo rhythms, and then there's a huge fire, and there's people dancing, doing ritual dances at the fire, and that's like the spot of his second.
That's actually a sort of, I don't know this for sure, but that sounds a lot like a reenactment of the Haitian Revolution I told you about in 1791. Not only could they turn plowshares into swords, and we learn about this history and stuff like that, and they sacrificed goats and all this, but it was a huge fire and a huge ceremony on the beach where they decided the next day they would overthrow the white folks. So yes, there is this notion of overcoming. Transformation. Trans means to go across, to change form, to change shape. How do we change shape? And this is why I don't want to diss on the 60s. It's a big deal. It's the most seminal civil rights. All that stuff is great. But for our lifetime, what Kendrick Lamar's references is a little bit more of an anger. That 80s that we hear in the Republican debates that was so great under Ronald Reagan wasn't so great for folks of color, or it wasn't really great for working class people all around the world, no matter what color you were. And Kendrick Lamar grew up with that. Kendrick Lamar might not know Rosa Parks. I'm sure he knows about it. But Kendrick Lamar remembers Chuck D. Kendrick Lamar knows Wu-Tang Clan, right? And the sad thing I'll say is hip hop is maintaining this resistance, just like voodoo, this social movement, this overcoming, while we shall overcome, to change forms, to change shape. In folk music, which I love, I just went to a Ann Arbor Folk Festival, and all I didn't hear one political song. I didn't hear one person mention the Flint water crisis. It's all me, this self. So at least hip hop. And by the way, when I was 15, they told me, especially when I would get in trouble by my white principals and assistant principals who treated me like a drug dealer and a wigger. That was the word they used, not my word. Well, this hip-hop thing's going to pass, this rap thing. What are you going to do in 15, 20 years? Well, guess what? It's 20 years later, and this hip-hop thing is not only not passed, it is the biggest thing in the world. And I go to Africa, and I have people dropping Kanye rhymes and Wu-Tang Clan, and find out I'm from Detroit asking me about Eminem. So this thing has gotten bigger, it's gotten global, and it's gotten vocal. And I'd like to see, I like the fact that it's associated with voodoo and this indigenous African sentiment of power, because these voodoo civilizations, these Ewe folks, the Yoruba, the Fon, the Akan, these are great civilizations. In fact, some of these civilizations were booming when Europeans were literally still living in caves. So it's good to see folks in music understand not only the historic importance of voodoo, but the ability it has to change form and to empower folks. And I think that's a good thing to see.
So, Dr. Eric Montgomery, what do we do with all that information now? We're trying to start something here with Culture Realm, and how do we, you mentioned that the goal was really creating mutual understanding and a sort of peace and conflict, kind of trying to bring people together basically as our goal. What steps do we take using this knowledge and having this desire to learn more about other people? Like, how do we promote peace?
Well, I think we're doing it now a little bit. I think if someone was to listen to this podcast, even an average adult, they probably know more about voodoo after a half hour of listening to me talk, and that isn't to toot my own horn, but just because they don't get real knowledge, than they did otherwise. So that's a big part of it. The other part of it, the other part of, I think, doing this with Culture Realm is we have to construct templates. So what we want to do with the website is we want to build these realms. We're going to start with Realm Africa or Realm Voodoo, and then we'll do our local area, Detroit. you and David, Graham and David, you guys are interested in the Middle East and the Arab world. So we'll start the templates and we'll start to post videos and we'll start to post articles and we'll have photo galleries and we'll map in our own culture and our own neighborhoods and our own things and our own ideas, just like you would uploading to YouTube or Facebook or whatever that, Instagram or any of these new ones, Tumblr, just like these social media sites. Only this one's not going to be about what you ate for food or how good your makeup looks. This is going to be about understanding culture, understanding religion, understanding complex, big, important things. And the reason I want to do it under that purvey is because of my influence in activism and peace and conflict studies. So ideally, I see this website as a collaborative, cooperative endeavor where people post their own stories about their own culture, about their own countries, about their own things they love and their own topics, and that we can look and share, and that ignites some conversation. After the conversation is there and we learn one another, hopefully we can shed some of this ethnocentrism, as Nishant says, move toward more cultural relativity, and maybe move toward a world in which we understand each other a little better. It's not enough to talk about diversity and to talk about multiculturalism. We have to live it. And the only way to do that is to embody it by understanding others. So I think the tools of visual and the acts, even in Africa, people have cell phones, people have access to cameras. I think to empower people to tell their own stories is an important thing. I don't think it's an important thing. I think it's an absolute mandate. We are on a path for destruction. Think about the possibility for this if you have Palestinian kids and in the West Bank or in Gaza Strip, and you have Jewish kids of the younger generation uploading and telling their stories.
Yeah.
And think about the power of that just in that context. Yeah. But what if we play that out throughout the whole world? What if we have police officers chiming in about how they're being disrespected and black citizens talking about how they're being over-policed and equally disrespected? If we can start a conversation, it's all about conflict management and dispute resolution. But before you can solve conflicts and you can resolve disputes, you have to know enough about the others. You have to have some skin in the game. You have to be willing to mediate. You have to be willing to compromise. But the first step is to empower you with knowledge. And I think a lot of what we get from our media, our online media, our social media, academic journals, books, novels, whatever have you, I don't think that they're coming from marginalized people. They're coming from real people. They're coming from elitist people, people with degrees, people who are on the scientists, people like anthropologists who think they know more about voodoo. A normal 16-year-old kid knows more about voodoo than I'll ever know. Now, they might not be able to put it in the context and frame it the way I do. So both the emic and the etic are important. But how do we get not just marginal people, but people who don't have a voice, whose story we don't know, how do we get them excited to share their story? And once they share their story and we start the conversation, we'll see where this goes. But for now, that's what I envision. And maybe you guys can chime in and talk a little bit about where you see the website going to.
I think that's really interesting because, 10 years ago, if you told people that everybody's going to be videotaping stuff on your phone and put, basically, in a way, Snapchat, for example, is like showing people like a 10-second piece of your life. And so but people would have said like 10 years ago, oh, not everybody's a videographer. Nobody's going to be interested in documenting everything. Not everybody's going to want to make a documentary film about their life every day, But now you see it by the same token, like not everybody's an anthropologist. So we might say, oh yeah, well, people aren't going to be interested in like talking about culture. Not everybody thinks like that. But
everyone's a critic. Everyone's a journalist.
We did it with Instagram. We did it with Snapchat. Right. And there's the possibilities are endless, really.
And we had an Arab Spring based on this. Of course, look, the Arab Spring has turned into more of an Arab nightmare. So it's not enough to just be able to talk and to be able to share content. It's what can we do? What can we do that? How can we create institutions of peace and institutions of understanding from these conversations? That'll be the next step, but I'm excited about that. I know you guys are excited.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, Nish.
I was just going to say that how does your expertise of peace and what you teach, how do you apply that to your knowledge of voodoo and how that's going to be advocated through the website?
Well, let me say this. For all the United Nations didn't invent conflict resolution. There are indigenous African institutions of dispute, just like there is in places like Lebanon and places like northern India. There's indigenous traditional law all around the world. It is as equally as effective as Western tort law. Let me just say that as a whole. So I think that the dynamic for peace and understanding is already within these African matrices of understanding and their philosophies all in themselves. But I think if we were to spend even a 1/100th of what we do on peace and reconciliation as we do on war, that we would be moving towards something. And I think the United States should have an institute of peace where the president actually has a cabinet member and an entire thing. Just like you have a secretary of war, we should have a secretary of peace dedicated to it. We're behind in this. Sweden and Finland and Scandinavia, they've led the way. We talk about human rights abuses in Cuba. We were at a talk this week, and it's like a joke. Here we are in Guantanamo, torturing people questioning their sovereignty on their land, and then we're going to say we're going to maintain a blockade with Cuba.
Democratic principles that they're not upholding.
And that hypocrisy has to go. In the younger generation, you've seen it in the anger, both of the followers of Donald Trump and also on the other side with Bernie Sanders. The younger generation is a lot more inclusive. It doesn't really have a lot of tolerance for this stuff. So we're already moving toward more peace and justice in the world anyway. But yeah, I think a class in peace and conflict studies, understanding the history of peace studies, understanding the difference between positive and negative peace, the importance of structural violence, how to broker a deal, what are the stages of genocide, how does diplomacy work, what are the problems with the UN? Like, these are big questions that need, and they're being answered all the time. And I'll say we don't need the UN to do it, even though the UN does a decent job. And I don't mean to diss the US. The United States Institute of Peace does some good things as well. But the most effective peace maintainers in the world are regional places like WAPI, the West African Peace Initiative, for example. They do a better job of maintaining peace in West Africa than the UN from above. And this is what we have to do in Syria and other places. We have to build, they all talk about it, regional coalitions. But the people, just like they need to take over this website and tell their own stories about their culture, they need to take over their countries and their regions and tell their own stories too. And maybe this can help in that. Maybe this can be revolutionary. And I don't want to use that word in a bad way. But in the end, revolution is not about violence. Revolution is about changing the status quo to make lives better for people. So peace and conflict is embedded in everything from my teaching to this podcast to everything I do. And it always will be. And I think anthropologists who are doing armchair anthropology, sitting in a couch like this and talking about, what's going on with the, rice agriculture and terrace farming in modern day Cambodia, I think they know a lot more when they go. I think that's what anthropology can offer peace and conflict. We do ethnography. We do participant observation. That's the one thing we do really well. And instead of doing that to sell products like they employ ethnographers and stuff, why don't we do that to sell diplomacy and to sell peace in the world? Instead of having people with law and economics backgrounds, working out peace accords and peace deals, we need to see anthropologists, sociologists, we need to see people with backgrounds in humanities and social science brought to the table in the world to do our diplomatic talking, so that because we understand other cultures and we can bring peace. Just like we understand a little bit more about voodoo, we can bring anthropological and cultural specialists in to provide insight to governments all around the world. So I hope that answers your question, Nish.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things is so for people that don't know the difference between anthropologists, sociologists, and
sure,
a lot of these social scientists, what's the major difference? What makes anthropology?
Well, anthropology. Ology, anytime you see ology, right, it comes from logos, the Greek word, which means the study of, right? Anthro means people. So anthropology is a study of people. From our predetermined archaeology past days, back to, the Holocene period and before that, all the way to voodoo in West Africa. And anthropology is the study of people. Sociology is the study of society. So they really go hand in hand, because when you're studying, they say anthropology is culture and sociology is society. Well, society and culture are overlap. But anthropology has 5 major disciplines. Cultural anthropologists, which is what I do. Archaeology, archaic means old, study of the past. Physical anthropology, biological anthropology, including some of the stuff you see in the and applied anthropology, which is urban anthropology and also medical anthropology, and then linguistic anthropology. Those are the main 5 fields of anthropology as a whole. But I don't think anthropology is our only way through it. I think that's just one way of seeing culture and understanding the world. And I think that the best thing about anthropology isn't the different realms of anthropology. I think the best thing about anthropology is the method and approach of participating and observing, of spending a long time with people, doing what they do, when they do it, learning their language, and really trying to get empathetic and inside, emically, into their shoes and understand it. That's the beauty, I think, of anthropology. Now, I think philosophy has other things to add to the debate. Anthropologists, we're not into philosophy. If you tell me there's only one God, Muhammad's his prophet, that is true for you. If you tell me if you don't offer a goat to Bangare, the warrior god, that he's going to punish you or make your child sick, that is true for you. Anthropologists are not into the dispute of absolute truth. That's for philosophers. What the people say is true for them. So that's anthropology's way of seeing it. That doesn't mean there's not room for comparative literature, that there's not room for medicine. You're thinking about going to medical school, All these labels are for soup cans, but the key thing is a holistic interdisciplinary approach. Instead of just saying how many disciplines can we use, but how can we use to, sometimes Marxism works to explain capitalism. Sometimes Marxism doesn't work. So when Soviet Union fell, Marxist scholars were asked, well, what do you got to say for yourselves? Well, when Marxism works to help explain things, we use it. The same thing is true with anthropology. The same thing is true with all these disciplines. Sometimes anthropology works well. Sometimes Marxist anthropology works well. Sometimes feminist anthropology works well. Sometimes anthropological approaches aren't very good at all, so we go to the realism of international relations or something like that. Holism, interdisciplinarianism, that's what I envision for this website, and I know you all do too. How can we add the big picture, the macroscope, holistic and be inclusive, and then how can we, after we've got the telescope and we've we've got the wide range and the scale and the depth of things, how do we then grab our microscopes and focus our microscopes, the telescope to the microscope? I got that idea from a book called America's Owner's Manual, How to Invoke Change. So on the one hand, we want the macroscope and the telescope, the big picture of what's going on, and then the microscope will be people's individual stories telling their own narratives about different cultural and different political events in their lives. So eventually we'll have culture around Pacific, culture around Mesoamerica, we'll have archaeology around, we'll have people talking about marijuana, we'll have people talking about human rights and water, we'll have people talking about pedagogy and childhood education, we'll have people talking about fishing, we'll have people talking about guns, ooh, God forbid, right? But the different things, because this is all culture, and these are all co-cultures, these are all subcultures. The big idea, the big vision with Culture Realm is to open up the parameters to all these cultural elements to people all around the world, to let them post their own content via video, via still photos, mainly short videos, and let's look and learn from each other. And then that collaboration and cooperative experience will create dialogue. And from that dialogue, hopefully we can have a more peaceful world. I think that's what I envision. I hope you guys do too.
We could keep on talking about this forever, but I think that would do it for...
No, and we are in Hamtramck, so I say we go for some Yemeni or Bengali food.
Yeah, that sounds good.
What do you say?
Dr. Eric Montgomery, thanks for...
Graham Liddell, Nishant Deluri, David Lyons, out.